Hello, podcast listeners. What you're about to hear is a panel discussion titled, If Not Aid, Then What? It's a discussion that examines whether a sector rooted in colonialism can truly shift power, and if not, what comes next. This event was held on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly this past September and was co-organized by the New Humanitarian, the Center for Transformational Change, and Refugees International. Two of the voices in this conversation, Lina Srivastava of the Center for Transformational Change and Nadine Saba of the Akkar Network for Development in Lebanon, will also feature prominently in a new podcast series we're excited to share with you in the new year. It's called Power Shift, and it brings together decision makers in the aid world and the people affected by their decisions for honest, one-on-one conversations about the sector's most pressing and enduring power inequalities. Thank you for listening, and happy holidays.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much. To those of you who were at the first panel, thank you for staying. If you just came in, thank you for coming. My name is Lina Srivastava. I'm the founder of the Center for Transformational Change. We're a social enterprise that looks squarely at the question of community-led social transformation through the narrative power of communities themselves. How do communities work on questions of displacement, climate justice, and inequality writ large through their own stories and through access to the media, to platforms, and to participation in economic and political systems. Thank you to Refugees International and to my partners, the New Humanitarian, for putting this together and for partnering with us. You are at the panel called If Not Aid, Then What? So we're going to be asking the question of what lies beyond the current global humanitarian construct. Given what we just heard on the last panel, for those of you who are here, in the midst of all of these challenges and struggles, I sometimes wonder whether it's even possible to envision a different future. Is it possible to acknowledge and confront our immediate realities while also reimagining new systems? It seems sometimes really like an impossible question. And sometimes it can feel like a frustrating one or even an insulting one. But it's clear we need new vision. We need new responses. Currently, a lot of the people who are doing the rethinking aren't the ones who are in the quote unquote field themselves. They don't live with the realities. It doesn't, I'm quoting a colleague here, it doesn't always touch them on their skin. So the risk in reimagining sometimes is just merely reverting to old ways, just with new faces. I want to know whose voices need to be heard, whose voices are truly being heard, and what are those whose lived experiences are of the oppressions themselves? What are they imagining beyond our current system? So I'm honored that there are 4 people with us who are currently thinking and trying to build beyond. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'm going to just also acknowledge that one of our panelists is not here with us. We were trying to get her here, but the reality is that she couldn't leave Lebanon. So I'm going to introduce you first. Nadine Saba is the co-founder and director of Akkar Network for Development, and she enjoys 18 years of experience with NGOs activities in Lebanon. She's a steering committee member of the Lebanon Humanitarian and Development Forum, serving as well in the NEAR Network of Empowered Aid Response Leadership Council, and acts as the NEAR Sherpa for the Grand Bargain and in the facilitation group. She's been involved with rural development programs and relief activities for Syrian refugees, women and youth empowerment, and child protection, along with development projects designed and provided trainings in Lebanon and in the region on local governance and women's empowerment. To my right is Alex Gray, the Director of International Funds for the Center of Disaster Philanthropy. As Director of International Funds, Alex Gray oversees all of the Center of Disaster Philanthropy's global funds and grant making, and manages existing partnerships, cultivates new ones, and ensures that funds are allocated responsibly, equitably, and to the geographies, issues, and populations that need them most. Hanin Ahmed, some of you already met her, is an emergency response room volunteer and Sudanese activist. She initiated the old Omdurman emergency response room, which helps with food supplies, medication, GBV, and evacuation centers. Additionally, she founded a youth network in Sudan to serve civilians' various needs and is a member of Peace for Sudan, a women's group advocating for peace. And last but not least is Aarathi Krishnan, who is the founder and executive director of Raksha Intelligence Futures and the former head of strategic foresight at UNDP Asia Pacific. In addition to working directly in fragile crisis contexts, Aarathi has worked for almost 2 decades with senior decision makers across governments, the UN system, and at international organizations on all aspects of risk intelligence, foresight, strategy, and governance. Thank you all for being here. And again, I want to acknowledge that Hanin and Nadine are both sort of at this panel while in the middle of dealing with immediate crises. So I want to thank you for that. I would like to begin the panel by asking you to just do a little bit of musing. I want you to introduce yourselves a little bit more to the audience and the people online, to give us your sort of current context. But what I wanted to know is, like, nearly every time we first discussed the idea of this panel with people, everyone seemed really excited to talk about building a future beyond the current global humanitarian system. So when you first heard about it, how did the idea of building a world beyond aid, how did that land with you? What was your reaction? And I'm going to start, Nadine, I'm going to start with you.
Hello. Thank you, Lina. Thank you, everyone. Honestly, I've been thinking since the morning. For me, it's 5:30, almost more or less, even 6 p.m. now. So I've been thinking since the morning about what to say in these couple of minutes. And I had different things in mind. Would I speak about the situation in Lebanon currently, the actual crisis, the war, the internally displaced people? Would I speak about the Syria crisis, its impact on Lebanon and the region? Would I speak on a more broad lens, looking into what communities and what most local and national NGOs have been facing and still face in every crisis? I honestly did not know where to give priority. Let me first give you an idea of where I come from. I come from a village in a rural governorate of Akkar on the borders with Syria. It's a rural, underprivileged area that had been previously deemed as one of the poverty pockets of the country, and that is displaying currently the highest rate of extreme multidimensional poverty in Lebanon. Its population is around 400,000. You add to this 100,000 Syrian refugees, you add to this in the last 3 days, more than 10,000 internally displaced Lebanese people from the south, a number that is increasing by the hour. At the same time, we have an economic crisis that have depleted the resources of people. We have the Syrian crisis impact that had overburdened the infrastructure. We have risks of food insecurity that are being real in Lebanon, number of children and adolescents out of school that is not decreasing, while the country is facing a political deadlock. Remember, we have had a humanitarian action for the last 10, 13 years with the onset of the Syrian crisis. And the question that I have been looming in my mind is, are we doing better now than we did 10 years ago? Is the situation better? At the time where the main thing that I hear on the global level is the funding gap, I have to ask myself, did we use those resources in the best efficient way? And would that have impacted our readiness for this crisis? And with a fragile context such as Lebanon, a context that is prone to shocks, that is displaying a diversity of these shocks, that have been displaying this diversity for a long period of time, are the tools that we used were the best ones? The best ones not only to respond to the immediate needs, but also to prepare and avoid, if possible, new and additional shocks. Yesterday, I was asked by a colleague, how are you? How are things? And I just vented. I just burst out. I was like, we need mattresses, we need blankets, we need water, we need food, we need dignity kits, we need hygiene kits, we need what is called, CRIs, the core relief items. We need what is called basic assistance. But then I thought, but what would happen within a week? What would happen in a month? What if it lasts even longer? What do we do? What if the conflict expands? What if the risks for our teams, our frontliners, ourselves get even bigger? And I want to salute you, Hanin. I want to salute your volunteers on all the effort that have been done. I've been hearing the first panel, and I feel with you. While I do understand that aid is not supposed to replace the state's institutions, and people and communities ought to rely more on themselves, but the question is also, with all the money and the resources that were put forth, wouldn't have we been able to do things differently, in a better way, providing more agency to the people, allocating more resources to local actors, accepting to take some risks, trusting a local leadership within this intervention, within this operation? So going back to the question, building a world beyond AIDS requires first and foremost accepting to have an honest look into the nature of the crisis and an even more honest look on our response, on the tools that we use and the assumptions that we make when we approach any intervention. At face value, it is a very appealing title, but are we truly ready to delve into it, to push through from the boardrooms and the fora, like the place that we are now, to a field experience? Because the field experience is different. Because the field experience is not what we discuss here. The field experience means the transformation of intermediaries, the transformation of the role of intermediaries. It means having donors with a larger risk appetite. It means questioning the long respected boundaries between humanitarian development, conflict resolution. It means accepting, trying new ventures, and acknowledging and accepting failure sometimes. Because what is happening at the moment is in many instances unrecognized, unacknowledged failure. So if people were excited to talk about such a future, as you mentioned, Lina, a future beyond the current global humanitarian system, then what is holding us back? What is holding us back from walking the walk? Is it about leadership? Who's going to take the lead on it? Who's taking the decisions? Is it where to put the local leadership in this? Is it a fear? Is it the fact that some organizations, intermediaries, do not want to relinquish power? Is it the fear of the unknown? Is it the fear of questioning our practices? I do not know what is holding us back. I wish I did. But what I do know, that in 10 years from now, if we are not bold enough to change within those years, we would be miserably failing our organizations and the sector, but most and foremost, the people that we are supposed to be dealing with, the people that we are supposed to be serving. So I'm not sure if I answered you or added to the confusion, Lina, but this is what I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You answered it beautifully. Thank you. Alex?
That's a hard act to follow. I know we're pressed on time, so I'll try and keep this as short as possible. So my name's Alex Gray. I work for the Centre for Disaster Philanthropy, and our mission is to mobilize philanthropy to basically spend money a lot smarter than what they do at the moment. We know, we can view philanthropy as part of the broader ecosystem of the humanitarian system, or we can view it as something that is often treated, because that's the way it is often treated, as something outside that doesn't interact as much as what we would like it to see from the philanthropy side. I've worked in the INGO space, and I've worked in the disaster and conflict and primarily fragile settings for most of my career, but have been in philanthropy now for a few years. I also chair a group of philanthropic donors called the Strengthening Local Humanity and Leadership Collaborative. And we are committed to investing in local leadership, not just in terms of funding local actors, which we can come on to in terms of the grand bargain commitment, but also investing in local infrastructure and systems that strengthen the local system overall, that allows local humanitarian leadership to have greater agency in decision making. And we've done a lot of really interesting stuff, which I hope we'll get into later on. We're here at UNGA. Humanitarian aid is not the summit's focus, but and I liked a few of the ideas being floated around, representation through citizens or parliamentary assemblies, and new ways of raising funds for public goods that go beyond aid, such as solidarity taxes. But I was also really disappointed to hear folks reading from the same tired old playbook about more money being the solution, because we've seen humanitarianism at its peak. We're not going to close that ever-growing funding gap without tackling the root causes of inequity and vulnerability in the first place. And that means working across the nexus. And so it might be quite controversial to say that I don't think the World Humanitarian Summit was a total failure, because I think the ideas and the principles and the issues it was trying to address were all right. And a lot of good ideas and plans came from that. But the failure was in the leadership to carry that out, and the accountability, and in the change management and the mindset changes that goes with that, to really enact the changes and solutions that were, so invested so much time in developing. And so I do think that, bringing back that term nexus, I know a lot of people have retired that, but at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, we do work with human rights and peace and security and development actors in our response. So where do I stand on this? I mean, I think that we need a two-track approach. One is to evolve the existing aid architecture, and there's some really interesting things that are happening at the moment. I think that we all have a role to play in the ecosystem, but the problem is that the power and resources are so unevenly and inequitably distributed in inverse and quite honestly, often perverse proportions. Lina, we just spoke about incentives and risk aversion and leadership. And there's just so much current waste in the system. And so what we have been doing in philanthropy and with a number of partners, even in this room, is trying to look at how do we cut out some of that waste. So if we just take localization at its most rudimentary and simplistic of definitions, which did it an injustice, this 25% going to local actors, it's so simple and is not really, in my view, what it's about. It's about equitable partnerships. One of our partners, we just, the Share Trust and the War on Day Advisory Center, and more recently with Refugees International, we did this Passing the Buck study in Ukraine. But they've published a series of studies looking at the efficiency gains you could get within the current system by enacting this 25%. And it's using economic data to support it. And so it showed that channeling funding via local intermediaries could yield efficiency gains as high as 32% compared to international intermediaries. And in the global north, intermediaries are often what they cite as where they feel most comfortable giving money to. But if that was local intermediaries, you've got most of that funding gap sorted out already, just from that 32%. Based on actual project data, in Ukraine alone in 1 year, 2023-24, if 25% of funding was deployed to the local actors who were getting some of those funds, you would have saved $256 million in 1 year that could have went to more programs, more local actors, and more impact. And so the other thing is the UN system itself is charging 2.5 times the cost for international staff as compared to INGOs with the exact same staff, and up to 28 times more for the same staff in local organizations. And so reforming the current system would close that funding gap, just if you put power and agency in the hands of those that are closest to the point of action. Of impact. And so a few things I would call for is full transparency from all actors on budgets and financing and how it goes. And, even between our bilateral governments and the UN agencies. They are not required to report back on how they're spending their money in a very transparent way. Passing through overheads, at CDP, we use a tiered system where local actors, the more local you are, the higher percentage of indirect costs and support costs that you get, compared to INGOs who get a smaller proportion. And then also a big role for philanthropy, which I hope to talk about today, is investing in innovation and new ways of working. As someone who works in philanthropy every day, I see so many in piloting different ways of doing localization. And the best results I've seen is when we partner with local actors, local humanitarian leadership, and communities directly. Because from where I sit, we have the solutions, we have the leadership, but we just don't have the political will and the decision-making power sitting in the hands of the right leadership in order to take these solutions, like local pooled funding mechanisms, like survivor and community-led response, like, just giving cash, and we'll talk about that later, like investing in social enterprise as a humanitarian response, so that local actors can generate their own profit and income and help their own communities, like investing in movements and movement building as a humanitarian intervention. And so I would just end with saying that the one hope I have is that the vast majority of people in the system do want to see the change. There are solutions, and it's just about putting the power and agency in the hands of the right people that have those solutions. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Hanin, the same question to you. How do you react to the question of building a future beyond aid?
I would say that ERRs already start building the future of the humanitarian aid by creating and innovating new ways to collaborate with other local actors and international actors. And also in the emergency response room, that we don't know each other, we're coordinating through WhatsApp groups. So these WhatsApp groups help us to build a trust through the year. So the majority of my colleagues, I don't know them personally, we don't even met, but we are working like brothers and sisters, and we believe that the genuine brothers and sisters can change this humanitarian system to the humanitarian system jamming with the situations and different situations on the ground. Thank you.
Aarathi, the same question to you.
So let me put some context before I answer this question. I was born in Malaysia. My grandparents were brought to Malaysia as indentured slaves to work on the railroads. My grandparents were recipients of aid. And I guess now, in one generation, 2 generations later, I live in New York City. I run my own firm. And I'm sitting here in a position of privilege. I feel quite uncomfortable sitting here because I do think that nobody needs to hear from people with privilege anymore. And I would much rather spend the time learning from Hanin and Nadine. So there's 2 things in which I'm going to respond to this. I'm going to do it with grace, and I'm going to do it with truth and honesty, and I'm not going to use the tired old words we're hearing: local actors, communities, nexus. What do they mean? We've had this question asked of us, and I've spent the majority of my career in the humanitarian system, by the way, very much started in the field and somehow ended up here. We've been asking this question for so long. I think the New Humanitarian convened its first discussion on this in COVID in 2020. How many times have we asked this? I don't know how many panels I've been on in Humanitarian Congress, and this all asking about what's next beyond the aid system. My question then is, if we've been asking for it, what's prevented it from happening? If everybody's excited about it, as my friend said earlier, then surely we should be interrogating what it is that prevents us from shifting anything. The humanitarian architecture doesn't exist in a silo. It sits very complicitly in systems of capitalism and in power, and in member states' power. So the fact that most of us will not call out or feel like we can't use specific words for specific things, as outlined by the panel this morning. The fact that we cannot say genocide or pogrom or any of the other truths of the reality that sit on our skin of this conflict and the wars that our brethren are experiencing. And yet we have to wrap it in much more nicer words, I think. Speaks to why I don't want to imagine a world beyond aid. What I want to imagine is a world where states can be held to account for blatantly contravening international humanitarian law. I want to imagine a world where people can get access, children are not blown up, people can get access to food, people don't have to work three jobs just to be able to put food on the table. And this isn't a global south, global north conversation, so to speak. We see these levels of injustices and inequity, even here in the United States, depending on which community you're speaking to. If you're going to go bankrupt for sending your kid to the hospital, that's not an equitable system. So I want to see a world, I want to imagine a world where we tackle and have the bravery and the strength within our heart and soul to look at evil in the eye, and I will call it out for what it is, and say, no, I believe people aren't, as I can't remember who on the panel said this earlier, maybe it was Alex, people don't just suffer from starvation, they are being starved. People don't suffer from not being able to grow their own food. They're not given access or networks or money. These are very specific designed programs in order to other all of us. And as long as we sit in spaces of othering, cruelty will happen. So that's what I want to imagine. The aid system, I want to maybe I recast that in my head after about 20 years in multilateralism. To me now, solidarity, how do I see you as a whole person? How do I extend care? How do I fight with you for the injustices that you are? There was somebody in the audience that talked about the experience of being an Arab American. I can't remember who it was. And I want to be able to proudly stand up and be an ally with that. I think humanitarians, we get so caught up in this idea of what being a humanitarian is, that we forget that fundamentally it's about standing up for the issues that we believe in. The humanitarian system was designed on principles, on a system of principles. It should have been designed, and maybe that was right for that time, coming out of the Second World War. But those global principles, those global constructs, social constructs that we held together for so long are fast being rewound. We're going backwards in time. And it doesn't matter which, we can call out Sudan, we can call out Gaza, we can call out Australia. I'm Australian. I think that the principles that we signed up to under the global humanitarian architecture, under the global aid architecture, are fast being unwound. I don't think we have the system in any way has any teeth in anything else. When I want to look for hope, it's that question about who's running into the fire rather than who's running away from the fire, who's stepping in and working out different ways of providing basic medical care, of who is opening up their homes. I am supporting the work that I want to support and we saw this when Afghanistan fell, were the WhatsApp groups that were forming up, trying to get friends, family, anybody out of danger, which is also what's happening now. So, in short, do I want to imagine a world beyond aid? I'd much rather imagine a world beyond cruelty.
Thank you. I think you just laid out our whole panel. But let's stay with this question for just a little bit. Before we talk about the future or what lies beyond aid, what lies beyond cruelty, let's talk a little bit about the present. One of the principles that I think holds the humanitarian sector back, and Nadine you and I have spoken about this quite a bit, is almost the industrialization, right, of this sector with its own jargon, its own acronyms, it's all these, sort of it's silos. But one of the things that does hold the sector back is this question of neutrality, right? Like, how do humanitarian organizations keep saying that they want to balance a commitment to neutrality, right, with the reality of crises? How can organizations keep clinging to that idea, given the state of the world right now? How do we sort of move the sector beyond that if the sector is going to survive?
So I just going to share our experience in the emergency response room, even when they want to appoint me as a former representative in the United States. They did a background check on, do I have any kind of political affiliation, or do we have, although I was a resistance committee, but I don't have any kind of political affiliation, because any kind of political affiliation or talk about politics or even involve your personal ideas on politics or what's going on right now, in our situation, it will harm our colleagues on the ground. For keeping our bodies safe and keep our colleagues safe on the ground or protect our body, we cannot involve ourselves or anyone who wants to advocate. We prevent anyone to advocate on behalf of emergency response room, except the representative, the former representative from the emergency response room, to talk about that, because you know that sometimes people take it as a personal thing, especially in such events that included Sudanese Force Army or people from government. They take it personally. Oh, that person who was affiliated, for example, to Freedom and Change and right now advocate. So that ERRs is affiliated to the Freedom and Change. You know, that play bad political games, and this is the chance they use it. So we just keep neutral, talking on the humanitarian, no involvement for any sides. Only we have, and this is very obvious on our paper and our documentation and on the advocacy.
Many years ago, I was one of the co-authors of the International Federation of the Red Cross Red Crescent's Global Strategy for 2030. And we went through a massive process of consultation for this. One of the things that came out from that was the mumbling that perhaps the fundamental principles of the Red Cross that's bound by the Geneva Conventions needs to be rethought. So this was back in like 2016, 2017. And the concept of neutrality was coming out a lot in that. How do we remain neutral in the face of such cruelty? I don't think the answer is a black and white one. I think certainly there are incredible repercussions to human life if you are perceived to take a certain way. But I think in the same time, we tend to, for those sitting in the comforts of white towers somewhere else, tend to hide behind concepts of neutrality for issues to protect the institution from issues of power, about funding, about where they're getting their money from, about how they can distribute that money. So I do think we have to look at the concepts of neutrality through plurality. In which ways and in which context do they unfold? And in some components, particularly in the institutional sense, I do very strongly believe that the concept of neutrality, maybe the fundamental principles, all need to be rethought of and recast in the age that we're in, and not a blanket, let's be neutral in the face of this, when it's actually a way for us to not take a stand. So I want to look about my years, very long career in the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, in the UN, and sometimes I feel a sense of shame, deep shame, that we hide behind these phrases because we are afraid of losing our funding. We talk about UNRWA this morning, right? And how many people felt the impact of not being able to speak out against the states that chose to withdraw funding straight away. Australia was one of them, and I felt embarrassed. But we must speak the truth. We have to be neutral when people's lives are at stake, but it is not a blanket option. And in my experience and in my expertise, we've lost the way because we took that as a blanket to absolve ourselves of our own accountability.
Nadine, I want to ask you the same question, but I also want you to, Aarathi just mentioned sort of headquarters and boardrooms and such, and I want to know from you, like, how can the humanitarian sector connect the real challenges faced by, say, local communities, or, you know, whatever we're calling them in crisis zones, with the often abstract discussions happening in boardrooms, and boardrooms that are adhering to this principle of neutrality? How do we bridge that gap between theory and actual experience of people in crisis? But also, is it even the right question to ask? Like, do we want to focus on what people in boardrooms are thinking?
Well, a couple of comments. First, when we are talking about neutrality, I do agree with Aarathi on the fact that it's not a black and white answer. However, a couple of notes. First, while I do agree on the centrality of protection, while I do agree on the fact that humanitarian work entails some additional responsibilities in some aspects, however, what I've been seeing in some places is the use of neutrality or principles of humanitarian work to push aside local actors. So for me, this is one of the comments that I would put forth in terms of this gap between the boardroom and the understanding of neutrality and the actual work on the ground. So for me, the use of principles in a way to just remain with the traditional players is also sometimes an excuse to eliminate a bit of the local leadership. That's my first comment. My second comment is, what is neutrality for each and every one? What is neutrality for an organization? Does it mean that the person who works within this organization, or who leads that organization, or who volunteers in that organization is no longer entitled to an opinion? Or does it mean that we as an organization, we have within our teams a multitude, a difference of opinions, of perspectives, however the organization itself doesn't endorse one or another? So also it goes back into what it is, because you as a person, or one as a person, when goes, at least I'll speak for a local organization, when they want to work, when they start within a social work, when they start within their work, it's coming either from a need in that community that is not met, either from a problem that they faced, or that there is something that pushed them to ameliorate, to improve. This is how most local organizations get started, because they want to do something in their community. So at one point, if you are telling them you need to be cut off from everything that's happening around you, you just need to do 1 + 2 = 3. Aren't we losing the essence of what is driving them? Aren't we losing this drive, this something that pushes them to go the extra mile? So what is neutrality for each one of us? If we go and talk, at least for the four of us, we might have different perspectives of neutrality. So how do you expect all organizations to have the same understanding of neutrality?
Nadine, I'm just snapping. Absolutely right. And I wish so much you were here. There's a couple. We're not neutral bodies. As human beings, we're not neutral bodies. And I cannot agree with her more when she talked about that we hide behind this as a way of then forcing out local markets, local actors, local employees from not doing jobs. I don't know how many disaster response initiatives I've been in, particularly in Asia Pacific, when we're going into a Pacific island that's faced a cyclone or whatever. And, we're not hiring local contractors to rebuild. We're paying $120,000 to fly in the logistics expert from somewhere else. And what that does is it doesn't get the market up and running. So are we really neutral, or are we just there to protect ourselves? And again, when we talk about neutrality, how many of us were pushing back against the images that are being portrayed in humanitarian action? I remember once, and I won't mention the organization, and I think it was in Sudan, and the doctor or whatever and he is white. He's got his Bose headphones on. He's got his Timberlands on, and he's leaning down at a black child as the black child is holding his hand. Is that neutral? You cannot argue neutrality when you don't see black and brown bodies as whole bodies that have dignity and are whole people. So it comes down to how we turn up in the world, what values we have, as Nadine said, individually, and do we see ourselves as the white knight coming in, so to speak, or the brown knight coming in, or whichever way, to save the situation.
Just small example. 3 months ago, some of people want to talk about emergency response rooms, and they have a political affiliation. Immediately, we have a lady get raped by RSF. 3 of our colleagues get tortured after this speech. So I don't know. Maybe they are right, but keep not talking about just the humanitarian aid only, not politics. This is a neutrality from our perspective as emergency response rooms.
I just want to add to like one just minor point. I think that and I don't think as human beings like you can ever be truly neutral to the things that we're talking about, because they're human beings. And I do believe that we all have and have this essence of humanity within us, and we see it in others. And so you may not be able to be neutral. I am often not able to be neutral, but I think there's a distinction between, just to go off what Hanin was saying, there's a distinction between being neutral and being perceived to be neutral in order to be able to protect space and to protect communities. And I think that, educating and folks, that are working, and humanitarian workers particularly, in that difference and knowing that it's a difference, but like saying it's okay to not be neutral, because let's just call it for what it is. Like, we're not. I'm sure we all have feelings about all the conflicts that are going on around the world and the terrible things that are happening to people who are suffering as a result of that and dying as a result of that. But I do think that, for me, and it would back up what Hanin is saying, is that the difference between, when you talk to someone on a one-to-one basis, and it's okay to not be neutral because you can't be, but for, externally, there are many reasons why it's very important to be perceived to be neutral.
Thank you. Let's stay on the question of local organizations and their leadership, whether it's their leadership in response or in reimagining. We have the problem, as we said, we have the problem with neutrality. We also have the problem of silos, right? Where organizations are expected to do one thing and one alone, or they're expected to bring not their entire whole selves, as Aarathi and Hanin have talked about, and Nadine as well. So, Hanin, I want to ask you, in your context, how do you and ER volunteers balance sort of responding to immediate needs on the ground, the impact of the war, and also innovating and remaining agile? Like, how are you balancing all of this?
Well, I think this is different, and this is what keeps us unique. I cannot explain how difficult for us to stay response for the emergence or urgent need coming from the ground for 20. So it's not 24/7; it's 48 in 24. It's too hard with time differences and different, and a lot of needs sometimes coming on the same time. For example, right now we have a massive evacuation in two areas in Khartoum, and also at the same time we have rape cases and disappeared women in other states in Sudan. So we are working on both things at the same time. So it's a lot of work on our side. It also keeps us traumatized because you get sad news from the ground. But the decentralization of the ERRs. This is the way that we innovate and we learn from the past experience. The centralization of the work keeps the work very tough on people and a lot of duties. But the decentralization allows us to work in different contexts with different capacities. As Alex said, that with our partners, we are able to build our capacity. So we are become more flexible to work with different tasks. And also we have a system called F system. F system, it's which is F1, which is the need coming from the ground. The base room delivers this need in the report. And then we have F2, which is sorting committee, deciding with whether this need going further or not. And F3, which is a contract between the state and the base rooms. F4, which is a financial report, shows that the invoices and all the financial documents for the sake of accountability to our community first, ourselves and our donors. Also, we have F4, which is narrative or program report, shows that the activity done on the ground. So this is how we stay agile and we stay innovative. And we need more recognition and more support to stay agile as a movement that we are preparing ourselves for the day after.
Thank you. Nadine, the same question to you. Like, how are you at Akkar? How are you balancing the immediate needs and sort of looking to the future, especially given the fact that you have no resources right now?
I agree with a lot of what Hanin had mentioned in terms of the requirements and the deliverables that we provide. But I think it also goes back into the question of what are we asking of the local actors versus what are we providing them with? At one point, it feels like local actors have this burden of excellence, are required to always do more with less. And it is true. And a lot of times we do it. I'll give you a small example. Our team at the moment was cooking some hot meals to be provided as dinner for the people who are displaced in the collective shelters. And at one point, we're like, where do we have the kitchen? Where do we put it? We had to talk to one mayor. He was able to give us the location. We had to talk to somebody else to give us some kind of first raw material to get done with. So at one point, it's just like you have to do it. You do not have the luxury of thinking so what do we do after that? How do we do it? At one point, you just need to roll your sleeves, do it and move. But at the same time, when you do such things, you wonder exactly what I was saying in the beginning, what would happen after 1 week? Because at one point, the people would not be able to give you anything. The people had to look into their own needs as well. So you do it in a very organic way. So when you look into what you have, you try to do it in a way that helps, for example, the local farmer who is in your area, who is in your village, to make sure that you have kind of a cycle in your community. You have to work in a sense that when you provide something to some people, you tell them that, at one point we might need you as well to help us with X, Y, Z. When you work with youth and you teach them and you do trainings with them and you ask them to help, for example, in the COVID, when you ask them to help in the distribution of masks, when you ask them to help in the cholera campaign, when you ask them to help in such things, I believe that certain things come organically. However, what needs to be done is to provide additional resources to local actors to do it in a systematic way. And when I'm speaking about resources, it is not always necessarily money. Yes, money is needed, but sometimes other things are needed as well. When you ask me to do certain things, you might want to give me access to a software. You might want to give me access to some additional information to train my people. So at one point, having these immediate long-term needs is what you do in an organic way, but it's not always systematic and it's not always done in the best way because you do it with whatever you have. You could do it much better, when you have additional resources in your hands.
So building on that, I have a question for both Aarathi and Alex on this. So both Hanin and Nadine have basically described what is an organic, integrated, full self approach to a certain extent. The crises that we are dealing with are, they're increasingly protracted, and they each are subject to external shock after shock after shock. So given that, given both of your perspectives, how do we start thinking about the questions of anticipatory action, right? How do we prevent the most dire effects of these shocks? How do we work with local communities to prepare them for this? What are you both seeing, and what are you both doing about this?
At the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, we specifically fund recovery and resilience because it's so underfunded. We produce a report every year called the State of Disaster Philanthropy, and it's always massively underfunded. I think resilience and preparedness is varies between 4% and 5% every year of all disaster funding, humanitarian funding, and the same goes for recovery, when we know that that's when the most needs are. So, as Nadine was talking about, I'll just give you an example of the cost of, again, it goes back to cost efficiencies. I think transferring what philanthropy is kind of like moving towards is trust-based philanthropy. And so we've invested a lot over the last few years with organizations like the Vital Foundation and Legatum Foundation, and we're Local to Global Protection, and some other actors like Christian Aid and Danish Church Aid, and this survivor and community-led response, which basically is just transferring cash to communities. There's often a local accompaniment model attached to it as well, but it's putting in place systems where the local, it's similar to what we're funding. We just launched a big commitment at the Clinton Global Initiative that Hanin and I were at together on Monday to try to invest more into mutual aid. And so we're generating a lot of evidence through that as well. And what we are finding so far is that, I was in Kenya, and a congressional delegation came out the week after us. USAID had spent $10 million in this area just doing cash and food distributions, and it was gone, and there was nothing left sustainable. We invested a few $100,000 and allowed the community to choose what to do with it, and they were able to build irrigation channels and get their agricultural practices back up and running, and develop women's cooperatives, etc., for an absolute tiny fraction of the price. And the yield was far greater, and it was sustainable. And to be able to just look at something that costs less than a tenth of the price, because you're allowing the community to decide what is your problem, where do you see the best solution, your context, you are having the discussions. And so we are a big advocate and are doing a lot of research into creating the evidence to be able to advocate to the broader system to just transfer over that money, because all the evidence that comes out, similar to where cash programming was. I mean, I remember when people thought you were crazy for giving over cash instead of, non-food items. And that was a long battle. And we actually, narrative was a big part of shifting that. And now, it's minimum each year is at least 25% of humanitarian funding goes to cash. And it's just an accepted modality now. And so why can't we do that with bigger grants at the community level? And that's what we are doing in philanthropy with a number of our partners. And the results we see are exponentially greater impact per dollar than what the current system is generating.
So I think what Hanin and Nadine very correctly and rightfully illustrate is we exist in a plurality of realities here, right? What we may think in one way from a boardroom governance perspective is completely different from when you're on the ground responding. So I'm going to answer this question very much from a governance perspective, which is the space I operate in. So, I run Raksha Intelligence Futures. We are an advanced risk intelligence organization. What we do is we work with multilaterals, international organizations, philanthropy, around how do we get better at understanding the drivers of crises, the intersecting connectors that might tip a situation into crises way in advance. So we're going beyond the anticipatory action timeline, beyond your 3 weeks or even arguably 3 months, to take it longer. And we have a sort of a three-prong, we look at 3 indicators. And it's based on the hypothesis of these are one element, one framework of understanding what tips states over into crises. A, how fiscally resilient is the state in its ability to withstand whatever shock is coming its way? What is the level of transparency around its governance structures and its systems? And what is the level of trust between its citizens and its policymakers? And usually what we can see, and again, this is not a perfect science, it's a hypothesis, that when one of those levers get tipped over, the state could still be okay. But once 2 or more get tipped over because of intersecting, connecting risks and shocks, it collapses. So our argument is, look, every single thing we're talking about here, we could see a mile off coming, we just didn't pay attention. The same thing was COVID, Afghanistan, Lebanon now. The triggers, the drivers, the root causes, which is always politics, always economics, always a fight for resources. If we can be better prepared, and if we can turn that level of understanding the intelligence into ways in which those in these governance positions can make decisions in advance, then yes, the investment into adaptation is worth much more than the investment into response. But this is an age-old argument. It's been the same thing for preparedness arguments. It's been the same thing for everything. How do we invest? How do we argue for the investment into something when it may or may not occur? So A, we got to get better at that. B, I sit in a lot of closed-door discussions that are confidential with different heads of embassies or multilaterals in a particular context, because they're concerned about a particular thing that is it's going to happen in the horizon. So we do a lot of this work. The hardest bit about that is getting different organizations with different mandates, all under the same architecture, to go beyond their mandate, to go beyond what they have to do with an institutional hat, and to actually come together as a system to solve problem X, and not try and bring their own solutions to put the cart before the horse, so to speak, before that's actually eventuated. And a lot of the work we do isn't data. We use a lot of data, but a lot of it is how do you influence human behavior in a way that heads of these organizations that have to make risky decisions will feel that they can make those risky decisions. And and I will say this based on fact, most senior decision makers will not make a risky decision unless they're protected from above. So if we want to talk about investing into mitigating or adapting triggers of crises before they actually become a crisis, then we also need to talk about the systems of risk appetite, as Nadine talked about earlier, the systems of decision making. How do leaders, and this is the question I get a lot, and nobody's got an answer to it. How do you make a decision in deep uncertainty? Now, I'll waffle on for 2 more minutes because I just want to make this point. The triggers that we're experiencing now are not siloed. We can't talk about conflict by itself. We can't talk about climate by itself. We can't talk about geopolitical issues by itself. They are all interconnected. But our institutions and governance structures are run on risk matrices of silos. For those of you that have had the unfortunate experience of having to fill out a risk matrix for your organization, and you're all smiling at me, so I know you feel the pain. But it's hard enough to price a current risk, let alone an emerging risk. When you cannot, let alone risks that are interconnected, It's very hard to get a system around that. If you cannot assign impact and probability around interconnected risks over a longer term time frame, you can't price it. When you can't price the risk, you can't govern the risk. When you can't govern the risk as an institution, who bears the brunt of it downstream? The most disenfranchised, the most fragile of all of us. And for us that sit in these positions, we go, well, that's a downstream problem. Let me worry about that later. I need to make sure I get my funding from XYZ. So that's what we're fundamentally trying to change. It is hard because how do we take off the institutional hat that allows people, these institutions that are doing, I mean, I guess at a mandate level, depending on which organization, really good work that we want them to do, to just do it. And it gets caught up. I don't know how many boardrooms I've sat in here in New York where there is no mention of community. It's like sitting in a McKinsey boardroom. Suddenly I'm talking about pricing and investment versus human lives. So there's an incredible, even between this conversation, you can sense the disconnect. Yeah, it's a complicated question, but I think there are ways in which we can get to muddling our way through it.
So when we're going to start transitioning to questions, when I was preparing for this panel, I had what might be at least 4 to 5 hours of questions. And I whittled it down and I had like 90 minutes of questions. I had 4 thematic topics. We got to 1. So I'm going to ask a question that's going to sound like it is sort of coming maybe out of nowhere. But before we go to questions, I want you each to sort of think about and answer the question, what would happen if there were no boardrooms and headquarters? Like, is there a point at which humanitarian response to climate, displacement, war, all of these things are handled only by communities, and we can say, we don't need you, you need us? Is there a point that's coming in the future?
Of course, we cannot say to anyone, we don't need you, even people who are our enemies. We always need people to be in our side, and this is what the idea of tolerance and trust building that we are working on it. We are trying to have less enemies as much as we can, have a wide wave of tolerance going on with different civil societies. I cannot say that we don't have a problem with different civil societies or with international organizations, some of them, but we are trying as much as we can to solve this problem, or try to find ways to collaborative and work closely together. Because at the end of the day, we are one family, one world, and we want to build a new system that everyone who cares about anyone. So this is the idea of equality and sharing resources from perspective of love first, and this is the idea of the emergency response room. I'm so sorry I have to leave. I have another meeting. Thank you for your listening, and I hope that can be very useful for you.
Thank you, Hanin. We have a few more minutes. So before we get to questions, if you wanted to talk about collective care and love and mutual aid.
So I very much believe in the principles of plurality, that multiple truths are true at the same time. And I think depending on context, we need multiple versions of this. I do, and we already see this, that your community responding to you and your needs, we see it all over the world, is far more effective. You're trusted, you understand your neighbors, you understand what's going on, you know where to go, all these things that we know about. I think that the role international organizations play might need to shift quite considerably because of 2 things. Their age of relevance, even with their host governments or sponsoring governments or member states, is shifting dramatically. Their ability to have access and their positioning and to get funding is shifting incredibly. And even their convening power, and if we've seen that in the last few weeks, in terms of trying to pass any kind of arguably logical resolutions to world crises is decreasing. We can't even get there. So what's that shifting role? Fundamentally, I do think that depending on what you're talking about in humanitarian response, decentralized networks and communities of care are incredibly important. But I will always support what Nadine is saying. The role we ought to be playing is getting resources, networks, access, making their jobs easier, and not putting the burden of being excellent on them, or the burden of always having to be resilient on them.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. I agree with all of that. You know, as I was mentioning, Hanin and I were with a commitment of a broad range of actors, made a commitment at the CGI this week to invest in Sudan specifically and in mutual aid there. And it was, you know, we've been investing in mutual aid for quite some time. You know, at CDP, we always, you know, we have an education arm and we're trying to educate donors about the fact that it is your neighbor, like who's there first whenever something happens. It is your neighbor, it is your community, and they do know best. And so, you know, even before localization was even used as a term, you know, I came into the sector 2 decades ago from management consulting. And, you know, I just looked at the way the system was set up and was like, this needs to be decentralized. That was my first job, was decentralizing as low as possible the budgets and resources to give, talking about risk, to give boards assurance that like they were not going to get caught out and it wasn't going to be a financial or fiduciary risk for them. A couple of things that was interesting this week is, you know, at CGI, we held this immersion exercise, like a simulation where we got even corporates and philanthropy and governments and local actors together. And just their aversion to risk, even in the private sector, is pretty shocking. So I would say that initiatives like the Pledge for Change, which, you know, Degan Ali and Deso had kind of led, where that was a long process getting INGOs in a room at the CEO level over a period of time to really look at what is the evolving role. And, you know, Ringo is another good initiative for this that WAXI is leading in West Africa. And but looking at what is an alternative role for some of these international players. And it is exactly what Aarathi is saying. It's convening and providing a platform for communities that are affected to have voice and agency, making introductions. I mean, I view that as part of my role in philanthropy, is, you know, working together. Just one very quick example is, you know, 2 partners, one in Venezuela, the Wayutai Foundation, and then Adesso in Somalia. We worked across with Hilton Foundation and the Gates Foundation, and we all, you know, pulled money together to help them develop water enterprises that were profit making, so that there didn't need to be dependence on foreign water trucking. I mean, which is just insane for, you know, 10 years in the same area in Somalia because no one had invested in any infrastructure. Whereas now in these areas, you have water treatment plants and, you know, boreholes that are accessible and pipe water to people's houses for literally, I mean, less than 1/10 of the price. And so for us, you know, I do think decentralization and supporting local leadership to work together in networks and movements that already exist. And just one last thing I'll say on that is we work a lot more closely now with the human rights and peace and security groups, because those networks, we primarily fund those networks now because the movements are already there, you know, and they're already deep in the communities and they have deep trust. And so we find that's the most effective way to not only transfer agency, but to make maximum use of resources, the limited resources that we have.
For me, my main problem is not having the boardroom. My main problem is how the boardroom is interacting with locals, how the boardroom is seeing the power dynamics with the locals. I do understand that when you're on the field, you see things from a perspective, and then when you just take a step back, you see them from a different perspective. And this is what a boardroom could do. And this is what something, but for me is how they conduct themselves with local actors. And here I'm talking local organizations, state institutions, networks of organization. Second is how they measure or how they understand efficiency, how they measure impact, and how they understand risk. And speaking about risk, actually, when you were mentioning risks, imagine that not only just you do the matrix and then you check first risk, currency devaluation, we had that. Second risk, pandemic, we had that. Third risk, explosion, we had that in Lebanon. Add to that now, fourth risk, war, we had that. Then do you imagine the feeling and the pressure that we as locals have? And when I say as locals, and I think there is one individuality or specificity for local NGOs, is that for the community, they are part of the system. And they are part of the sector that sometimes fails them. And for us, we believe that, yes, we see the failure, we see the issues, and sometimes we have very little power to change. And this is where I say that my problem is not with the existence of the boardroom. My problem is with the conduct of that boardroom. My problem is with the power of that boardroom. My problem is with the equality, you know, the peer-to-peer between the boardroom and what's happening on the ground.
Thank you. We have time for a few questions.
Hi, thanks so much. First of all, for a really sort of refreshing panel discussion here today. My name's Chris Frassetto. I worked with ICRC for almost a decade. My question is sort of bringing us back to accountability. You know, as you know, humanitarian organizations aren't often very willing to engage operational humanitarian organizations in an accountability discussion. And there's a lot of reasons for this. You know, coming back to worry about compromising humanitarian principles, worry about retaliation, whether that's access denial, expulsion, or worse. And in some cases, there are actual immunities for organizations that prevent giving evidence or in a testimony in an illegal proceeding. So, you know, on the flip side, accountability is a very powerful tool for increasing the global protection network, or having an impact on very cyclical nature of many protracted crises. So if humanitarians are not really willing to be the champion for accountability, who can sort of fill this void, in your opinion, in terms of mobilizing governments and the international architecture that we do have for accountability?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm going to be a bit cynical. Do you really think that as humanitarians, anybody is being able to hold any government accountable? And then going back to the neutrality question, how do we balance the neutrality requirement with the accountability requests? I am all for accountability. But then aren't we asking for one thing and the opposite? I ought to see that. I would love to see that. Don't get me wrong. But I'm just answering because I felt that I heard different mixed signals within this. I do believe that humanitarians ought to raise their voices, ought to speak the truth. But at the same time, are we being able, what are we waiting on the balance? Are we really being able to affect that? Or is it because we're only talking ourselves? Is it because we're working in silos? Is it because we're not talking with other practitioners in different other sectors? I think that our voices are not that much heard, maybe potentially because of a bit of our own deeds, because we have portrayed ourselves in a sense as being this elitist kind of holding on to principles while the others might not be holding on to those principles.
Knew there'd be a fellow Red Crosser in the audience. So I think before I answer that, I want to perhaps reframe it in a slightly different way. I think we're talking about humanitarian organizations, but the role of humanitarianism and the role different organizations play is very blurred at this point. You can argue, I mean, I came from UNDP and they would want to do humanitarian work and the argument was always, why can't we access humanitarian funding and why is it always going to the humanitarians? And that blur is happening. I think if we're talking about accountability to whom? Upstream or downstream? Why? What is the purpose and the objective behind that accountability? Now, if we're talking about access during a humanitarian crisis, so the work ICRC does, MSF, World Central Culture, like fundamentally life-saving work, that they need to do that, then they do also have to juggle that upstream accountability in some way. But then if they cannot be truthful because of a variety, I mean, look, let's speak the honest truth here. All of this is issues of power. It's about geopolitical power. It's about money. That's it. That's it. And that may be cynical, but that's fundamentally it. Now, if organized institutions that are trying to do life-saving work need to be a little bit careful because of repercussions or funding or anything, it doesn't mean that the whole system has to be silent. There are many, many, many other institutions that can pick up the slack, that can speak up when others can't. And right now, we don't. We just don't. UNRWA, what happened with UNRWA was horrific. How many organizations, other UN agencies also spoke up at the same time? So again, existing in plurality, where one part of the system has to act in a certain way, other parts of the system can act the other ways in which to balance it out. And right now we don't, as Nadine has said, because we don't want to, I think we're all hiding, Nadine. Scared, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I do know, but I don't want to say it out loud, but yeah.
This is Mustafa Ali. I'm the co-managing director for Refugee Seat. I think just kind of maybe a couple comment and question. I hope, soon that we start moving a little bit away from the idea of bringing voices or amplifying voices. I think the voices of the local communities and refugees on the ground are already there. Maybe we need to bring a little bit more ears to hear those voices, than not kind of the other way around. But I think on also the idea of it's a dangerous rhetoric, I think right now, where some people trying to make the play as either the local community or the INGOs and the UN system. I think this is not what we have been trying to advocate on the ground. Maybe the best case scenario is around co-management system. That needs to happen a lot more. And this is something where still far from happening. But then the idea, I think we need to acknowledge the fact that there is a need for UN and INGO system, but at the same time, there is a need for the local organization and that kind of collaborative approach. And I think the conversation should go around the co-management. It's not about who replaced the other. The last kind of a question, Alex, also kind of a little bit for you. It was interesting when you mentioned, like that local organizations or UN bodies or employees will get 28 times more kind of the local organization. And I feel also sometimes there is also this kind of a rhetoric where like you go to the local organization or refugee-led organization because it's cheaper. I think now we're just trying to use a little bit more effective. But there is also an important thing where, yes, maybe the UN pay is at the extreme high, but also the local organization is that extreme low. So is there also kind of something in the studies where what is the balance? What is the middle point? What is fair for the local organization? It should not be always the case right now being promoted that, we should go with the local organization just because they are cheap and they can get you much more. But then is there some studies is also that how far those local organizations and actors on the ground from making at least fair and decent living for doing the work they're doing in that way? That's it.
So from online, from Amber Cripps, who's an anthropologist who works on gender mainstreaming in humanitarian aid. She says, thank you so much for an interesting discussion. She loves the discussion about power dynamics with local actors. I'm interested in how aid can better take into account diversity and gender dynamics within the quote community, unquote, which duplicates the level of power dynamics. I assume she means at a higher level. So thank you.
Alex, do you want to take the first question?
I don't want to misquote the studies, like in terms of exactly how I'm going to respond to this, but parity was taken into account when we were calculating that, so that makes the findings even more shocking. And yeah, so I would encourage you to read them. The Passing the Buck reports, they're very digestible, but that was considered because we're obviously don't want, I mean, that it's not about, you know, I'll go with local organizations because they're cheaper. It's paying equivalent, achieving parity for the same work, right? So that was built into the studies. So that would be the first thing I would say on that. I agree with what you were saying about, you know, when we talk about elevating voices, yeah, you do need to bring the ears. I've never heard it said that way before, but I'm going to steal it now from going forward because I think it's a good one. But I think one of the things that I feel that we're in a pivotal moment now, you know, even without getting into the whole global governance mechanism. And this UNGA was particularly interesting in terms of, you know, some of the agreements that were signed and the discussions that were had around power sharing and kind of what the Security Council was going to do. Now, obviously, they say a lot of things and they don't ever follow through, and there's the accountability issue again. But I do think that there is a kind of middle ground, because I agree with you. There is a need for these institutions because look at what's happening around the world right now, and with the leadership in those countries, and there is something to be said for having global multilateral system. It's not evenly, you know, power is not evenly distributed, but to have agencies, you know, we talked about the ICG in the previous panel, and, you know, but to protect human rights and to protect humanity from a lot of the evil that we spoke about that is out there. And so I think it's about what is their role going forward in that. And then you said one more thing, but I forgot what it was, so I'm going to stop and I'll come back to it if I remember.
So for the second question, I just want to pick up on what you said, Alex. So there was a statistic that I saw on LinkedIn that at this UNGA, number 79, less than 10% of the speakers were women or people who identified as women. And that goes to the second question. So to Nadine and to Aarathi, I'm going to ask you to address this. How does the humanitarian sector continue to do this? How is it still the power dynamics are gender, sexuality, all these, all the different kinds of identities are not being taken, into account in terms of participation and inclusion. And also, I'm going to add a question for both of you to end on, is when we do think about the future, how do we make sure that we're not replicating those power imbalances?
First, I wanna thank the person from the audience, I did not recall the name, who talked about the ears and not only the voices to be heard. So that is true in a lot of instances. Now, the second thing about gender and about women and about the statistics that you mentioned, Lina, I think that the problem we're facing is mainly in the leadership, because the representation that could go to the UN General Assembly or to the speakers who would speak or talk are mainly the representation or the leadership. And this is where I believe that we as practitioners ought to be mentoring additional new faces to be there. And I could tell you that in Lebanon, it's a bit the reverse. And a lot of the local NGO, we see a lot of women being active. And I was really shocked to hear what you've said. The way we see it, the way we work on it, is just to make sure that we have all across, from the outreach field perspective to the project management perspective, having a diversity within the organization. But other than this, it needs as well to be worked with the community. It needs as well to be streamlined in the different interventions. And this goes into very tangible things, from ensuring that you have daycare for the children, to ensuring that when you have young girls meeting in a group, in a committee with a local municipality leader, that you have a strong facilitator that gives them the opportunity to talk and talk freely. I'm going to take a bit of time here because I'm going to tell you a personal experience that happened with me. I was training a group of young people in one very rural area, even of Akkar. And then there was this young girl who started to speak about a real solution to the question I asked. And then she was interrupted. And then she stopped. And I was waiting to see, would she repeat? Would she say it louder? She did not. And they did not solve whatever we had to solve. And then I talked to her and I said, why didn't you repeat it? Why didn't you say it louder? And she's like, we're not used to speak loudly. And I think this is a habit that we have. And it's a habit in the collective memory of communities to have, and I speak here about girls because we work a lot with girls and women who are used to be put aside in crisis. And usually whenever you have a crisis, their priorities, their needs just go to the lowest bench. So for me, it's a dual work. It's working within the organization, it's working within the community, and ensuring that we have a mentoring component, a coaching component to encourage others to, go into this ladder and reach managerial and leadership positions.
All right, you get the last word.
Okay, I think you said the multiplicity of identities that we all carry, right? I'm not going to just talk about the humanitarian sector because this is an aid sector issue. It's an aid sector issue. When you fill out your forms, it's still women and girls, men and boys. What about the plethora of other identities? And we don't even consider when people have multiple identities. You could be an Arab man and queer and a civilian journalist, was a dear friend of mine, who wears all these identities and is doing advocacy work and has different types of stresses to his security as a result of that. No, we see the world in checkboxes. And when Nadine talked about this earlier as well, the tools we use, and I'm going to quote from bell hooks, the tools that we use represent the patriarchal racist structures that we come from. When we reduce people to tick boxes, we do aid by tick boxes, right? The actual analysis, the thought, is this right to do? What harms could happen if I do this? We've reduced it to tick boxes because of risk aversion, because of accountability. Hey, you want to go do a community engagement and accountability program? Here's a form and make sure it's all filled out, and then we submit it to the system. We reduce our identities to tick boxes, all of us. And when we do that, we don't imagine that the way we live, let's say here in New York City, and the multiple identities I can carry and switch between very easily, that's not the same to people, societies over there. Black and brown bodies don't have those same freedoms or that ways of living, and that's a fundamental untruth. When we don't see things in the truth in which it exists, which our tick boxes checklists do not allow us to, then we reduce it to boxes that fulfill our capitalist, patriarchal, gendered, narcissistic ideas of how the world should work. So I'll finish with a quote from bell hooks because I love bell hooks. Are we merely maintaining the oppressive system? And I'm completely butchering this, but are we fundamentally maintaining the systems of oppression and butchery of the racist patriarchy that we are continuing to uphold by continuing to have these same practices, these same tools, do we need, if we are talking about reimagination, then we need to reimagine everything, and not just in ways that uphold the systems that are doing injustice for all of us.
That's it. Thank you.
I want to thank our speakers. I want to thank all of you. I realize that we have sort of overshot our time, but thank you very much for staying with us. I'll finish up by saying that Jeremy in the last panel had talked about the battle over narrative. The work that I do is all about narrative power. It is how narrative power, how the narratives of communities and the people who are most affected by the issues that we're dealing with is a catalyst for transformation towards justice and equity in different futures. And I think every single one of our speakers today have demonstrated what narrative power can do, just the stories and the experiences that you all have brought. I want to thank you very much. And the other 3.5 hours of topics, I'm going to come back to you. We're going to do another session. So thank you very much, Refugees International, the Humanitarian. Thank you to all of you, and thank you most of all to all of you. Thank you, Nadine.